You didn't ask for this video. You stumbled into it. Maybe you were scrolling at midnight. Maybe you were avoiding something. Maybe you just followed some invisible thread without knowing why. And now you're here, reading these words, and something in you is already deciding whether to stay. I want to earn that stay. So I'm going to tell you something that most spiritual content will never say out loud, the idea that you need to be more awakened, more conscious, more evolved. That idea is itself the trap, and the fact that you're exhausted by that chase, that exhaustion is not failure. That exhaustion is actually the first honest thing you've felt in a while. There's a word that ancient philosophers used for a state of being that exists beyond the seeker, beyond the searching, beyond the desperate accumulation of spiritual identity. They called it Sophia, not a destination, not a reward for the disciplined or the dedicated, a recognition, a quiet, almost embarrassing recognition that the thing you've been hunting across books and retreats and breathwork sessions and 3 a.m. journal entries has been sitting inside you, completely unbothered, the entire time. This is not a video about how to get there. You cannot get there, but you might already be there, and I think these 8 signs are going to confirm something you've quietly suspected for a while, even if you've been afraid to say it out loud. The first sign is one that doesn't look like progress. It looks like nothing. Your old wounds are still visible if you know where to look. The memory of that relationship still exists. The year when everything fell apart hasn't been erased from your history. The version of you that was humiliated, rejected, betrayed, that version still happened. But here's what's changed. When you turn toward those memories now, there's no fresh bleeding. There's scar tissue that's actually stronger than the original skin. Carl Jung spent decades trying to understand why intelligent, capable people kept destroying themselves with the same patterns. His answer, stripped of all the academic language, was this: we don't heal by conquering the dark parts of ourselves. We heal by finally acknowledging that those dark parts were always trying to protect us, even clumsily, even destructively. The wound was never the enemy. The wound was a messenger that didn't know any other language except pain. In the Sophia Stage, that message has finally been received. You don't revisit the old stories obsessively anymore. You don't rehearse what you should have said. You don't rebuild the case against the people who hurt you, not because you've become a saint, but because the trial is over. The verdict was already reached, and the verdict wasn't guilt or innocence. It was simply, this happened, and it made me exactly who I needed to become. There's a specific kind of dignity that comes with accepting your own story without either romanticizing it or condemning it. You stop editing your past for other people's comfort. You stop apologizing for the chapters that were ugly. You were there. You burned. You didn't come through unscathed. You came through whole, which is something completely different. The second sign is the one that spiritual culture desperately doesn't want to talk about because it makes most of the industry unnecessary. Your spiritual ego has quietly dissolved. Alan Watts was one of the most genuinely funny thinkers of the 20th century, and his sharpest joke was always the same joke. The ego is so clever that it will dress itself in monk's robes and incense smoke and convince itself it has transcended the ego. The seeker who has read the most books about non-attachment becomes the most attached to their identity as a non-attached person. You know that person. Maybe you were that person for a while, quietly measuring your vibration against others, feeling that private flicker of superiority when someone confessed to still struggling with something you'd already worked through, collecting spiritual credentials like badges, needing people to know you'd done the inner work. In the Sophia Stage, that performance becomes genuinely uninteresting, not through discipline or humility practices. It just loses its flavor. You stop reaching for the label of awakened or conscious or evolved because you've noticed those labels are just a fancier version of the same hunger that makes people chase status through money or status through appearance. The need underneath is identical, only the costume changed. And when that need dissolves, something surprisingly ordinary takes its place. You can sit across from someone who is right at the beginning of a journey you've already walked, and you feel no urge to accelerate their timeline. You can watch someone make an exact mistake you made 10 years ago and genuinely, not performatively, let them make it. Because you understand now in your bones, not just your mind, that some lessons refuse to be borrowed. They can only be lived. Your respect for other people's processes has become absolute. And that's not detachment. That's actually the most loving thing you can offer another human being, the trust that they are capable of finding their own way. The third sign lives in your body before it lives in your mind. There's a branch of neuroscience that emerged in the 1990s from a researcher named Stephen Porges, who was trying to understand why some people can walk into a room full of chaos and remain internally settled, while others are destabilized by the mildest uncertainty. His polyvagal theory mapped the nervous system states with a precision that suddenly made a lot of previously inexplicable human behavior make complete sense. Fight, flight, freeze. And then a fourth state that most people rarely access for extended periods: genuine social engagement, genuine safety, genuine presence. In the Sophia stage, your nervous system has reorganized itself around that fourth state. Not because you're avoiding difficulty, but because difficulty no longer immediately registers as threat. Your body has developed a kind of wisdom that operates below conscious thought. You feel the tightness in your chest before your mind has formed the words for what's wrong. You notice the quiet expansion in your ribcage when something is genuinely right, before logic has had a chance to complicate it. Your body has become an instrument that you've learned to read, not a problem you're constantly trying to manage. And perhaps more importantly, you've stopped trying to maintain a constant state of elevated feeling. The spiritual marketplace sells enlightenment as a kind of permanent glow, a continuous high, a life without the weather of depression or anxiety or plain ordinary flatness. You know now that this is not only a lie but a harmful one. Low states are not evidence of regression. Grief is not a sign that the work has failed. Some mornings you wake up and everything feels grey and difficult, and that is simply what is true that morning, and you let it be true without performing recovery for yourself or anyone else. That capacity to be fully present even to the unbearable, without fleeing upward into spiritual bypass, is one of the most quietly radical things a person can do. The fourth sign is one that used to terrify you and now no longer does. You are genuinely complete in your own company. Arthur Schopenhauer, who was deeply unfashionable for most of his life and only became celebrated toward the very end of it, wrote something that sounds cold until you understand what he actually meant. He argued that a person's capacity for solitude is a direct measure of their inner wealth. He wasn't recommending isolation. He was observing that most of what humans call connection is actually distraction wearing connection's face. Two people using each other to avoid the unbearable quiet of their own minds. You know the difference now between relationships that come from fullness and relationships that come from hunger. When you were hungry, you chose people who would temporarily fill the hollow place. The hunger drove the choices, and then the hunger would return, louder, because the hollow place was never really about the other person at all. Something shifted. The hollow place didn't disappear, it transformed. It revealed itself as spaciousness rather than emptiness. And from that spaciousness, you began to choose people differently, not because you needed them to complete you, but because their presence genuinely added something to what was already whole. Your relationships became less desperate and somehow more intimate because of that. You could love people without needing them to be the answer to a question you were carrying. That's a completely different kind of love. Cleaner, more generous, less secretly transactional. And the solitude itself became something you looked forward to rather than feared. Not because you became antisocial, but because you discovered that your own company, fully inhabited, contains more than you expected. The universe does not feel smaller when you're alone. If anything, it opens. The fifth sign is harder to describe because it lives in the quality of how you act rather than what you do. Your will has changed at the root. Schopenhauer's central philosophical preoccupation was what he called the blind will, the insatiable unconscious hunger that drives human beings to accumulate, achieve, pursue, and then pursue again, because the satisfaction of any desire only briefly quiets the hunger before it roars back louder. He saw this as the engine of most human suffering, and honestly, looking at most human behavior, it's difficult to argue with him. You used to operate from that engine, the to-do lists that were never finished, the goals that immediately generated new goals the moment they were reached, the sense that you would finally be allowed to rest once you'd achieved the next thing, and the next, and the one after that. The arrival that never arrived. In the Sophia Stage, something fundamental has decoupled. You still have desires, you still pursue things, you still work and create and move toward goals. But the engine has changed. You are no longer running from something, you are genuinely moving toward something. And when you arrive, you're actually present for the arrival instead of already scanning the horizon for the next destination. You do your best work and then release your grip on the outcome. Not as a spiritual practice you're forcing yourself to maintain, but because the clenching genuinely feels unnecessary now. You've experienced enough cycles to know that the outcome usually has its own intelligence, and your job is to show up fully and then trust the rest. This is not passivity. This is the most powerful form of action there is, fully committed, completely unattached, genuinely present for whatever the result turns out to be. The sixth sign shows up in your relationship with time, which sounds abstract until you feel what it actually means in an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. You've stopped postponing yourself. For most of your life, there was an implicit deal you'd made with the future. Once I sort this out, once I reach that point, once I've done enough work, then I'll allow myself to simply be here without apology or explanation, or the low-grade anxiety of being behind schedule. Schopenhauer called this the fundamental trick the will plays on us, keeping the real experience of living permanently just out of reach, always one achievement away, always contingent on something not yet completed. The finish line that moves every time you approach it. You have stopped making that deal. Not because you've solved everything, not because your life is now arranged perfectly, but because you've had enough direct experience of presence to know that presence doesn't require those conditions. You can be completely here on an ordinary morning, with unresolved problems and an uncertain future and dishes in the sink, and find that being here is genuinely enough, not as a consolation prize, as the actual thing. The main event you spent years thinking was somewhere else. And the past has lost its court costs. You no longer run the old proceedings in your mind. The what-ifs and should-haves and if-only-I-hads have mostly gone quiet, not because you've repressed them, but because you've genuinely accepted the only possible truth about the past. It was the only way it could have gone, given what existed then, and it brought you exactly here. Every detour was the route. Everything that felt like a wrong turn was the map. The seventh sign is a subtle one, and the spiritual world gets it wrong almost constantly. Your compassion has grown up. It has lost its rescuing instinct. Jung was careful to point out, and his clinical work confirmed this repeatedly, that the impulse to save people from their suffering is not always an act of love. Sometimes it is an act of fear. Specifically the fear of witnessing pain without being able to stop it. The savior complex is not a sign of excess love. It is often a sign of an inability to tolerate another person's difficulty without making it about your own need to feel useful. In the Sophia Stage, you can sit with someone in genuine pain and not reach for the solution. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough to trust them with their own experience. You have learned the difference between holding space and taking over the space, between being present with someone and trying to manage their process so it makes you more comfortable. Your compassion now has an extraordinary quality that most people never develop. It holds steady under pressure. When someone you love is suffering, you don't collapse into their suffering, and you don't armor yourself against it. You feel it clearly, you let it matter, and you remain upright. That uprightness is the most useful thing you can offer another person. Not solutions, not wisdom, not five-step frameworks. Just the evidence that it is possible to remain whole in the presence of difficulty. That is quietly revolutionary. You've also stopped giving advice that wasn't asked for. You've stopped nudging people toward the path you think is correct for them. You've accepted, at a level that has nothing to do with polite restraint and everything to do with genuine conviction, that you do not know what another soul needs in order to become what they're becoming. That's not modesty, that's honesty. And it has made your relationships cleaner, more mutual, more real. The eighth sign is the one that will either land immediately or seem completely underwhelming, which is exactly how it's supposed to work. The ordinary has become the sacred, not as a concept, as a direct sensory experience. Alan Watts spent much of his career pointing at the same invisible thing from different angles, and the thing he kept pointing at was this: the transcendent is not somewhere else. It is not available only in elevated states, only in meditation, only in the mountains or the temple or the ceremony. It is available in the next 10 seconds of your actual life if you are genuinely present for them. There is something that happens when you're washing dishes after dinner, the water warm against your hands, the light doing something specific to the soap bubbles, the particular quiet of the kitchen at that hour. If you're actually there for that, fully there, not running through tomorrow's list or replaying this morning's conversation, there is something present in that moment that doesn't have a name, not bliss, not enlightenment, nothing dramatic, something simpler and somehow more complete than either of those things. You've started noticing this. The exact sound a kettle makes in the last 30 seconds before it boils. The specific quality of early morning light before anyone else in the house is awake. The weight of your coat on your shoulders when you step outside on a cold day. These are not metaphors for something else. These are the actual fabric of existence, and you are finally present for them without needing them to be more than they are. You've stopped chasing peak experiences because you've discovered, through direct experience rather than anyone telling you, that every experience is peak when you're fully inside it. The hierarchy between the spiritual and the mundane has collapsed. Not because you brought the sacred down to earth, but because you finally recognized that the earth was sacred the whole time. You just kept looking for it somewhere else. None of these 8 signs make you special. This is important enough to say slowly. Sophia is not a spiritual rank. It is not an achievement that places you above others on some invisible hierarchy of consciousness. It is, if anything, the opposite. It is the point at which the whole project of being someone special, being someone evolved, being someone who has figured it out, quietly loses its appeal. You're not above the noise, you've just stopped adding to it. What remains when all of that falls away is something embarrassingly simple. You are a person. You have a body that carries a history. You have a mind that has been shaped by things that happened to you. You have a capacity for love and a capacity for cruelty and a preference for some things over others. You exist for a span of time that is genuinely unknown to you. And within that span, you have the option, available in any moment, to be completely present for your actual life, rather than the idea of a better life you're still waiting to begin. That choice, made quietly and repeatedly in ordinary moments, is the whole thing. Not the beginning of the whole thing. The whole thing If something in these words felt less like new information and more like remembering something you already knew, I want to hear that, not to confirm it, not to validate it, because this conversation is genuinely more interesting than a monologue, and the comment section below this video might be one of the few places on the internet where people are allowed to say something true without performing it. If you want to stay close to this kind of thinking, to ideas that are less interested in elevating you and more interested in returning you to yourself, then this channel is where that happens. There are no promises of transformation here, just the honest attempt to think clearly about the things that actually matter, and sometimes that's exactly what's needed.
I personally researched, wrote, and prepared this video to bring your accurate and meaningful content. Subscribe for more original content.